Creepy Mall Santa Encounter. I wasn't planning on taking my son to see Santa that day. Honestly, I just wanted to pick up a few last-minute Christmas gifts and get out of the mall before the crowds got overwhelming. But when we passed the big Santa display, my 5-year-old Liam begged to go. His little face lit up when he saw the decorations and the line of kids waiting to sit on Santa's lap, so I gave in. It's one of those things you do because you know it'll make a memory, even if it means an extra 30 minutes of chaos. I wish now that I hadn't. Santa seemed normal at first, cheerful and jolly, like you'd expect. Liam climbed onto his lap, told him he wanted a Lego set and a puppy for Christmas, and grinned for the camera. But then, as I was helping Liam down, Santa leaned closer to me. His voice dropped, just loud enough for me to hear, and he said, "You're raising a good boy. He's going to grow up just fine, as long as you keep him safe." I froze. It wasn't the words exactly, but the way he said them. It didn't sound like a general holiday platitude. It felt personal. Too personal. I laughed it off nervously and ushered Liam away, but something about the way Santa's eyes followed us as we left the display gave me chills. The rest of the shopping trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake that unsettling moment. By the time we got home, I had mostly convinced myself I was overreacting. People say weird things sometimes, right? I focused on getting Liam settled with a snack and his favorite cartoon. The rest of the evening was normal, until I went to take out the trash. That's when I saw him. The Santa. He was standing across the street, near the corner, just outside the glow of the street lamp. My stomach flipped. At first, I thought I must be imagining it. But when I looked again, he was still there, motionless, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called my neighbor, a retired cop named Dan. He lived 2 doors down, and we'd always helped each other out. I told him someone suspicious was outside, and within minutes, he was at my door with a flashlight. By the time we stepped outside, Santa was gone. Dan told me not to worry. Maybe it was just someone passing through. But I knew what I saw. When I checked all the locks that night, I couldn't stop replaying that eerie moment in the mall. The way Santa's eyes seemed to pin me in place. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing. I told Liam we'd have a lazy day at home, but I kept glancing out the windows like a paranoid lunatic. Around lunchtime, the doorbell rang. I froze. Nobody was supposed to come by, and I wasn't expecting a package. When I looked through the peephole, my heart nearly stopped. It was him. Santa. He wasn't in the full costume, but he still had the red coat and the same white beard. He was holding a package and smiling like he belonged there. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called through it, asking what he wanted. He said he had forgotten to give Liam something yesterday, and insisted on handing it to him personally. My stomach turned as he kept talking, his voice cheerful but strangely firm, like he wouldn't take no for an answer. I told him to leave it on the porch and go, but he just kept standing there. When I finally threatened to call the police, he chuckled softly, muttered something I couldn't make out, and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before opening the door, but all he left was a blank envelope on the porch. No package, no gift, just the envelope. I didn't want to open the envelope, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words written in big, jagged handwriting. "See you very soon." My stomach dropped. I grabbed Liam, locked all the doors, and called the police. When I explained what had happened, they didn't seem to take it seriously at first. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding," the officer said. But then I mentioned the Santa outfit and how he had shown up at my door. That seemed to get their attention. They sent a patrol car to drive through the neighborhood and told me to call back if he returned. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every creak of the house, Every shadow outside the window made my heart race. Liam, blissfully unaware, fell asleep easily, but I couldn't close my eyes. Around midnight, I thought I heard something, a faint shuffling noise near the back door. I crept downstairs as quietly as I could, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my phone. When I reached the kitchen, I saw it. A boot print. It had been snowing lightly, and there was a single wet boot print on the tile just inside the back door. I locked it earlier, I was sure of it, but somehow it was open. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought I might faint. I didn't dare turn on the lights, afraid it might alert him, whoever he was, that I was awake. I double-checked the back door, locking it again and wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. Then I crept to Liam's room to make sure he was still sound asleep. Thankfully, he was, clutching his stuffed dinosaur without a care in the world. I stayed there for a moment, watching him, feeling both terrified and furious that someone was threatening our safety like this. I called the police again, barely able to keep my voice steady. They said they'd send someone over immediately. While waiting, I sat in the dark living room, gripping a kitchen knife I'd grabbed on my way back down. Every sound outside felt amplified, the wind against the window, branches creaking, the faint hum of a passing car. When the police finally arrived, I practically threw open the door to let them in. They searched the house and the yard thoroughly but found no sign of anyone. The officer noticed the boot print in the kitchen and confirmed it didn't match my shoes or Liam's. He said it was possible the back door had been tampered with but couldn't say for certain. The officers promised to keep a patrol car in the area for the rest of the night, which gave me a little relief, but I still couldn't sleep. I ended up sitting by the window, staring into the street, hoping to catch any sign of movement. By morning, nothing else had happened, and I was starting to feel like I might have been overreacting. Maybe the boot print was older than I thought, or maybe I just hadn't locked the door as tightly as I remembered. That's what I told myself, anyway, to stay sane. Then I found the note. It was taped to the side of my car, written on the same kind of paper as the one left in the envelope. It read, "Nice try last night. Maybe next time." My stomach churned as I scanned the street, but there was no sign of anyone watching. I called the police again, and this time, they seemed to take things more seriously. An officer stayed with me while I packed a bag for Liam and me. My parents live about an hour away, and I decided it was safer to stay with them until things calmed down. Before we left, I checked on Liam's favorite toy, a small, battered stuffed animal he'd carried everywhere since he was a toddler. It was missing. I tore the house apart looking for that stuffed dinosaur, but it was nowhere to be found. It didn't make sense. Liam had been sleeping with it the night before. I asked him about it on the way to my parents' house, but he just shrugged and said, maybe Santa took it to fix him. The way he said it so casually sent a chill down my spine. I didn't want to scare him, so I let it go, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. How would Liam even come up with something like that? At my parents' house, things felt calmer. I kept the police updated, and they assured me they were investigating. Still, every time I thought about going back home, my chest tightened. A few nights later, as I was tucking Liam into bed at my parents' house, he suddenly sat up and said, "Mommy, Santa's outside." My blood ran cold. I forced a smile and told him it was just his imagination, but when I peeked out the window, there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed up late again, pacing the house and double-checking the locks, but the night passed without incident. The following morning, my mom handed me an envelope she said she'd found slipped under the front door. My stomach sank before I even opened it. Inside was a single photo, a picture of Liam sleeping in his bed at my parents' house. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. On the back of the photo were just 2 words, "Still watching." I felt the room spin around me. Whoever this was, they knew where we were, even after I thought we'd escaped. I called the police immediately, barely able to get the words out through my panic. When the police arrived, they took the note and photo into evidence and set up surveillance around my parents' house. They advised me to keep Liam inside and avoid drawing attention to ourselves. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Around 3 a.m., I heard the faintest knock at the front door. Not loud enough to wake anyone else, but deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching my phone, until the knocking stopped. In the morning, I found a candy cane tied with a red ribbon hanging from the doorknob. That candy cane was the last straw. I was done trying to act calm or rational. I demanded that the police station assign someone to stay with us full-time, and thankfully, they agreed. A patrol car was parked outside my parents' house for the next 2 days, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to breathe a little easier. But it didn't last. On the third night, just after midnight, there was another knock at the door. This time, it was heavier, more forceful. The officer stationed outside had apparently stepped away, and I was too terrified to answer. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but the next morning, we found muddy boot prints leading from the street to the front porch. The police finally decided to search the area more aggressively. They canvassed the neighborhood, checked local security cameras, and started asking questions around the mall. That's when they found out the man dressed as Santa had never been hired by the mall in the first place. Whoever he was, he'd set up there without permission, and by the time mall security realized it, he had disappeared. The realization that the man had been an imposter all along made everything worse. He'd been watching us from the start, blending in like he belonged there. The police increased their patrols, but I could tell they were just as unnerved as I was. Despite their efforts, they never caught him. After a week with no new incidents, I decided it was safe enough to go back home. Liam didn't understand why we'd left so suddenly, but I didn't want to scare him with the truth. I told him we'd just been visiting Grandma and Grandpa for a while. To this day, I don't know who that man was or why he targeted us. The only clue left behind was the stuffed dinosaur, which I found weeks later in our backyard, half buried in the snow. I wanted to throw it away, but Liam begged me to keep it, so I reluctantly let him have it back. The police closed the case eventually, chalking it up to some disturbed individual playing games. But every Christmas season, I feel that same knot in my stomach, wondering if he'll ever come back. Sometimes, I swear I can hear faint knocking late at night, but when I check the door, there's nothing there. Just silence. Christmas Eve burglar. I was 8 years old the Christmas this happened, and it's still one of the clearest memories I have of my childhood. Back then, we lived in a cozy old house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but my parents had worked hard to make it feel warm and festive, especially around the holidays. That year, we'd strung lights around the windows, and my mom had gone all out decorating the tree with glass ornaments she'd collected since she was a teenager. I remember how the living room always smelled like pine and cinnamon, with the soft glow of the tree lights reflecting off the presents beneath. Christmas Eve was my favorite night of the year, and that night, I couldn't sleep. I was too excited to see what Santa would bring. It must have been close to midnight when I slipped out of bed. The whole house was quiet, the kind of stillness where even the faintest creak of the floor feels loud. I crept down the hallway toward the living room, hoping to catch a glimpse of Santa, or maybe just sneak one of the cookies we'd left out for him. I wasn't scared of the dark back then, but something about the shadows in the living room felt different that night. The tree lights cast long, shifting patterns on the walls, and the air felt colder than usual. As I peeked around the corner, my heart leapt into my throat. There was a man, someone I didn't recognize, kneeling by the tree, shoving our presents into a large, dark bag. At first, I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was my dad, though the figure was too tall and too thin. Maybe it was Santa, but the way he moved was too rushed, too deliberate, like he was in a hurry to leave. The man wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and the only sound was the soft rustling of wrapping paper as he tore through the gifts. I wanted to scream or run, but all I could do was stand there, clutching the edge of the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then, as if he sensed me, he stopped. His head snapped up, and for a split second, we locked eyes. Or at least I thought we did, though his face was mostly hidden in shadow. My stomach dropped. I must have made a noise, because he slowly stood up, his posture stiff like he was deciding what to do next. My legs felt like they were made of jelly, but instinct kicked in, and I stumbled back down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't dare look behind me, convinced he was right there, reaching out to grab me. When I made it to my room, I slammed the door shut and dove under the covers, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. I stayed under the covers, barely breathing, straining to hear what he was doing. My room was just down the hall from the living room, and every tiny sound felt magnified. The creak of a floorboard, the faint jingle of an ornament being moved. At one point, I thought I heard him muttering to himself, though the words were too quiet to make out. I kept telling myself to wake up my parents, but I couldn't move. It was like my body refused to obey me, paralyzed by fear. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, praying he'd just leave. And then, the sound that broke the silence sent a chill down my spine, the sharp, metallic rattle of the front doorknob. I realized he wasn't just stealing our presents. He was trying to get out. My dad had locked the door from the inside, and I guess the burglar hadn't noticed when he came in. The door wouldn't budge, and the rattling grew more frantic. My heart raced as I imagined him realizing there were people in the house. I wanted to cry, but I bit down on the edge of my blanket to keep quiet. Finally, I heard a loud crack as he forced the door open. A rush of cold air followed as he bolted into the night. When I finally worked up the courage to leave my room, the house felt eerily still, as if the air itself had been disturbed. The living room was a mess. Wrapping paper and ribbons were strewn across the floor, and the tree looked bare, its ornaments scattered or missing entirely. The cookies we'd left for Santa were gone, crumbs left in their place, but not in the way I had imagined. Instead of a magical visit, it felt like something precious had been tainted. I stood there for a moment, my hands shaking, before running to wake my parents. When they saw the living room, their faces fell. My dad grabbed the phone to call the police while my mom hugged me tight, whispering that everything would be okay. The officers arrived quickly, asking questions and taking notes as they inspected the damage. They told us ours wasn't the only house hit that night. The burglar had broken into at least 3 others on our street, taking presents, decorations, even the stockings off the mantle. They said it was unusual for someone to strike on Christmas Eve, and even more unusual for him to target homes with lights on, like ours. That part stuck with me. It was like he wanted to be seen, to leave us with the feeling that no place was safe. The rest of the night felt surreal, like I was trapped in some bad dream I couldn't wake up from. My parents tried to salvage what they could of Christmas, but the mood was shattered. I remember my dad pacing back and forth, muttering about how the guy must have come in through the back window, which he found slightly ajar. My mom was quieter, her face pale as she swept up the broken glass from a shattered ornament, a red one she'd had since she was a kid. I stayed close to her, afraid to let her out of my sight, half convinced the man might come back. When morning came, the daylight didn't do much to ease the unease hanging over us. Neighbors stopped by to check on us, sharing their own stories of missing gifts and broken locks. The strangest detail came from Mrs. Palmer, who lived 2 houses down. She swore she'd seen a man in a dark hoodie walking down the street earlier that evening, carrying what looked like a Santa sack over his shoulder. I thought it was one of those last-minute deliveries, she said, shaking her head. That image stuck with me, a twisted, reverse version of Santa, not giving joy but stealing it. Over the next few days, the police came back a couple of times to ask more questions, but they didn't seem optimistic about catching the guy. They said burglars like this rarely left much evidence, especially when they moved so quickly. My parents did their best to keep things normal for me, but I could tell they were shaken. My dad bought new locks for every door and window, and he even started sleeping on the couch for a few nights, just in case. But for me, normal didn't feel possible anymore. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I couldn't walk past the Christmas tree without remembering the man's silhouette crouched there. What haunted me most, though, wasn't just what he took, it was the way he looked at me. That brief moment when his eyes met mine, or at least when I thought they did, felt burned into my memory. I'd lie awake at night replaying it, trying to convince myself that he hadn't seen me, that he didn't even know I was there. But deep down, I knew he did. There was something deliberate about the way he stood up, almost like he wanted me to see him, to remember him. I never told my parents that part. I figured it would only make them worry more. Even now, years later, I can still picture him, standing in the glow of the tree lights, holding that bag of stolen gifts like some kind of twisted ghost of Christmas. As the weeks went by, life slowly returned to normal, or at least something close to it. My parents tried to turn the break-in into a lesson about safety, teaching me what to do in an emergency and making sure I understood that the man was gone, that he wouldn't come back. But their reassurances didn't do much for the lingering fear that crept into my thoughts every night. I stopped looking forward to Christmas the way I used to, and I couldn't help but feel guilty about it, like I was letting that man take something else away from me. A few months later, my dad came home with news that the police had arrested someone they believed was responsible for the burglaries. They didn't share much, but apparently, the man had a record of breaking into houses around the holidays, targeting homes with decorations because he figured they'd have something valuable inside. Hearing that gave me some closure, but not as much as I expected. I kept thinking about that night, about the way he moved, the strange quietness of it all, and the look he gave me when he realized I was there. Even now, I wonder if he ever thought about me, the scared little kid peeking out from the shadows, or if I was just another house he'd crossed off his list. It took years for me to truly let go of that night. Every Christmas after, I'd help my mom decorate the tree and put up the lights, but something always felt different. The magic of it, the excitement and joy I'd felt as a kid, was dimmed, replaced by a subtle unease I couldn't shake. Still, my parents worked hard to make sure the holidays were special, and eventually, I started to feel like myself again. But even now, as an adult, I double-check the locks every Christmas Eve, and I never leave the tree lights on overnight. Looking back, I've come to see that night as a turning point, the moment I first understood how fragile a sense of safety could be. It wasn't just about the stolen gifts or the mess he left behind. It was about the way he took something intangible, our peace, our security, and left us with a shadow of uncertainty. And yet, in a strange way, it also brought my family closer. We leaned on each other in the aftermath, finding comfort in the simple fact that we were all okay, that we still had each other. That's what I hold on to now, every time Christmas rolls around. No matter what was taken that night, he couldn't take that. Neighbor Paul and the kidnapped child. Paul was the kind of neighbor you'd almost forget existed. Quiet, kept to himself, always had his lawn trimmed perfectly. My wife, Jenna, and I used to joke that Paul was so normal he was boring. But last December, during the holiday season, something about him changed. It started with the Christmas lights. Paul never decorated for the holidays, not even a wreath, but out of nowhere, his house was strung with mismatched lights. They didn't blink in a normal pattern. They flickered erratically, like someone turning a switch on and off. At first, I thought maybe he just didn't know how to set them up properly, but Jenna was the one who noticed something odd. The flickering wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like words. One night, after we got home from grocery shopping, Jenna made me stop in the driveway and look at Paul's house. The lights were going wild, flashing in short, rapid bursts followed by long pauses. She swore it looked like Morse code. I laughed it off, told her she was being ridiculous, but something about it stuck with me. The next day, when I was bringing the trash cans back in, I saw Paul watching me from his window. It wasn't casual. He was standing perfectly still, staring through the glass like he was waiting for something. When I waved at him, he turned away so quickly it made my stomach twist. That's when I realized Jenna might have been onto something. The next evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jenna suggested we try to figure out if the lights really were signaling something, so we Googled Morse code charts and sat in the dark, watching Paul's house through our living room window. The lights flickered rapidly, short flashes, then long ones, then short again. Jenna started scribbling down dots and dashes, muttering under her breath. After a while, she froze. "It's spelling help," she whispered. I laughed nervously, telling her she'd probably made a mistake, but my palms were sweating. We couldn't just ignore it. That's when we heard it. A faint, muffled sound like crying, coming from Paul's direction. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but Jenna's face went pale. She insisted we call the cops, but I hesitated. What if we were wrong? Paul might have been weird, but accusing him of something like this? That felt insane. Jenna didn't wait for me to make up my mind. She grabbed her phone and dialed. While she was explaining everything to the dispatcher, I crept out to our backyard to get a closer look at Paul's house. Standing behind the fence, I could see his basement window faintly glowing. That's when I heard it clearly, a child's voice, sobbing. The police arrived faster than I expected, but the tension while we waited felt unbearable. Paul's house looked so ordinary, so quiet, that I started doubting myself. But then, just as the officers knocked on his door, the lights flickered again. This time, it was slower, almost deliberate, as if whoever was controlling them was scared to keep going but too desperate to stop. Paul opened the door, looking calm. Too calm. He acted surprised to see the cops and even invited them inside. But his expression changed when one officer mentioned the complaints about disturbances. Jenna and I stayed on our porch, watching as they questioned Paul. At one point, I saw him glance toward the basement door, his face tightening for just a second before he recovered. That's when the officers seemed to catch on. One of them asked if they could check his property, and Paul's reaction was almost imperceptible, but I caught it, a twitch, a hesitation. Then he said, "Sure," in this overly casual way that made my skin crawl. The officers headed inside, and for a few minutes, nothing happened. Just silence. Then we heard shouting. The shouting escalated into chaos. We saw Paul try to push past one of the officers, but they tackled him to the ground right there in the doorway. More police cars pulled up, lights flashing, as the officers rushed into the house. Jenna grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and whispered, "They found something." I couldn't move. I just stared at the scene unfolding. Minutes later, two officers emerged from the house, carrying a little boy wrapped in a blanket. He looked terrified, his face streaked with tears, and his eyes darted around like he was searching for danger. The boy clung to one of the officers, trembling so badly I could see it from across the street. Jenna gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. That's when it all hit me. The flickering lights, the muffled cries, the odd behavior. Paul had been holding that child in his basement this whole time. I couldn't believe it. The calm, boring neighbor we'd lived next to for years had kidnapped a child. The boy was loaded into an ambulance, and Paul, now handcuffed, was shoved into the back of a patrol car. He didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead, his face blank, like none of this was real. Even after Paul was taken away and the flashing lights of the police cars faded, I couldn't go back inside. Jenna and I stood on the porch, staring at his house, now eerily dark and quiet. I kept replaying everything in my head. How long had the boy been down there? How many times had I walked past Paul, waved at him, while he had a child locked in his basement? The thought made my stomach turn. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those flickering lights spelling out help, and the boy's terrified face. The next day, an officer came by to ask more questions. They wouldn't tell us much, just that the boy had been missing for weeks and that Paul's basement had been soundproofed. He'd only managed to get the lights to signal because Paul left him alone long enough to figure out the control box. The officer thanked us for calling it in, but it didn't feel like enough. I kept thinking, what if we hadn't noticed? What if we'd ignored the lights or brushed it off as paranoia? Paul's house stayed empty after that, and eventually it was put up for sale. But no one in the neighborhood ever looked at it, or each other, the same way again. Crawl space intrude. Back in the spring of 2019, my wife and I had just moved into a modest ranch-style house on the edge of town. We were in our late 30s, no kids, just 2 dogs and a lot of dreams about starting fresh in this quiet neighborhood. The house wasn't perfect. It had creaky floors and a slightly musty smell that no amount of air freshener could cover, but it was ours. Underneath the house, there was a crawl space. It wasn't much, just a narrow, low area that ran the length of the foundation. I'd only gone down there once when we moved in, just to check for leaks or damage, and I remember thinking how claustrophobic it felt. But I never gave it much thought after that. A few months in, we started noticing odd sounds, especially at night. At first, it was faint, something like scratching or scurrying. My wife, Erin, joked that it was probably a raccoon setting up camp. I wasn't so sure. The sounds didn't match what I'd expect from an animal. They were too sporadic, too deliberate. One night, around 2 a.m., we both woke up to a loud thump that seemed to come from directly beneath our bedroom floor. The dogs went crazy, barking and growling at the air vent. I got up to check outside, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing unusual. Still, I convinced myself it was an animal and promised Erin I'd seal off any openings to keep critters out. The next day, I crawled under the house to inspect the space. Armed with gloves, a flashlight, and a roll of mesh wire to patch up any openings, I pushed aside the flap of the crawl space access. The smell hit me first: damp earth, mildew, and something else I couldn't place, almost metallic. As I inched forward, the flashlight beam danced across the dusty wooden beams and spider webs. I found a couple of loose vents, which I assumed were the culprit. While fixing one near the far corner, I noticed a strange patch of dirt that looked disturbed, like someone had been digging or moving things around. But it didn't register as anything alarming at the time. I just finished patching up the vent and got out of there as quickly as I could. For a week or two, things were quiet. I felt proud, thinking I'd solved the problem. Then one night, the noises came back, louder and closer. This time, it wasn't scratching. It sounded like dragging. Erin was terrified, and honestly, so was I. But I didn't want to show it. I told her it must be something big, like a raccoon or an opossum, and promised to set some traps the next day. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. Every time the house settled or the wind blew, I imagined something, or someone, beneath us. The following evening, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. With Erin at a friend's house for a much-needed distraction, I grabbed a heavier flashlight, a crowbar for protection, and my phone, just in case. As I crouched to the crawl space entrance, I felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on me, a mix of dread and adrenaline. The moment I slid inside, the metallic smell was back, stronger than before. I aimed my flashlight toward the disturbed patch of dirt I'd seen earlier, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just dirt. There were flattened cardboard boxes laid out like a makeshift bed, along with a crumpled blanket and an empty can of beans. Panic set in. Someone had been living under our house. My first instinct was to crawl out and call the police, but something made me stay. I shined the light further, scanning every corner, half hoping, half fearing I'd see something, or someone. That's when I noticed a dark silhouette at the far end of the space, pressed against the foundation wall. It didn't move, but the shape was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, a head slightly tilted to one side. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My voice cracked as I shouted, "Who's there?" No response. The figure didn't budge. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, staring at that shadowy figure. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds before survival instincts kicked in. I scrambled backward, nearly hitting my head on the beams above. My flashlight slipped from my hand, plunging everything into darkness. That's when I heard it, a sharp, quick inhale, like someone breathing in through their teeth. It wasn't an animal. I clawed my way out of the crawl space as fast as I could, my knees scraping against the gravelly ground. Once I was outside, I slammed the access panel shut and shoved a heavy rock against it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone to call the police. They arrived about 15 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. I explained everything, and 2 officers went down to investigate. Erin came back while they were still searching, her face pale when she saw the patrol cars. I tried to reassure her, but I could tell she didn't feel safe anymore. Neither did I. The officers emerged about an hour later, their expressions grim. They didn't find anyone, but they found evidence that chilled me to the bone. There were more signs of someone living down there: empty food wrappers, a half-burned candle, and a notebook filled with scribbled notes. The writing was erratic and nearly illegible, but one word kept appearing: watching. It was scrawled over and over, sometimes filling entire pages. One officer handed it to me in a plastic bag, saying they'd keep it as evidence but that I should be cautious. They didn't find any clear point of entry, which made it all the more unnerving. After they left, Erin and I barely spoke. That night, we barricaded the crawl space access with concrete blocks and a padlock. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. At one point, around 3 a.m., the dog started barking furiously at the vent again. I grabbed the crowbar and waited, but nothing happened. By morning, I was so exhausted I could barely think straight. Erin suggested staying with her parents for a while, and I didn't argue. We stayed at Erin's parents' house for about a week, trying to convince ourselves the worst was over. The police had assured us they'd patrol the area more frequently, though I doubted it would make much difference. On the 8th day, I decided to stop by the house alone to check on things and grab a few belongings we'd forgotten in the rush. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. Everything was as we'd left it, except for one small, chilling detail. The crawl space access panel was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was certain I'd locked it before we left, even piling blocks against it as an extra measure. Gathering every ounce of courage, I crept toward it, crowbar in one hand, flashlight in the other. The rock was still there, but it had been pushed aside. I crouched to peer inside, but the darkness seemed thicker, almost impenetrable. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I leaned closer, shining the flashlight, when I noticed something new: a small, neatly folded piece of paper sitting just inside the entrance. My hands trembled as I reached for it. Unfolding the paper, I saw a single sentence scrawled in the same jagged handwriting from the notebook. "I like watching you sleep." My blood turned to ice. Whoever had written this hadn't just been living under our house. They had been inside it. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the note, and ran to my car without even closing the front door. As I sped away, my mind raced with questions. How long had they been there? Had they been watching us the whole time, or was this a recent invasion? And worst of all, what else had they done while we were asleep? When I showed the note to the police, they took it seriously, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no fingerprints, no clear evidence of forced entry. They suggested installing security cameras and reinforcing all potential points of access. Erin and I didn't even go back to the house after that. We broke our lease, losing our deposit, and moved into an apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't until months later, when I was unpacking some boxes, that I found the notebook the police had let us keep. I couldn't bring myself to open it again. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Aaron and I eventually moved out of town altogether, trying to put the whole ordeal behind us, but it left a permanent mark. I installed cameras in every home we've lived in since, but I still wake up some nights, heart racing, convinced I'll see that same shadowy figure in the corner of our bedroom. The worst part? The intruder was never caught. The police closed the case due to lack of evidence, and I'll never know who they were, what they wanted, or why they chose our house. Sometimes I wonder if they'd been living under other homes before ours, moving from place to place, staying just out of reach. And other times, I'm terrified they haven't moved on at all. Maybe they're still out there, watching, waiting.